It's been a great pleasure to meet your city for the first time. So academics do more traveling than we should, but we don't always go where we should either. So this was a very big treat for me, and I'm very grateful to SALT for making that visit possible. Okay, so I'm going to start my talk with this chestnut of modern art history. And there's a parable around this artist's work, a parable of autonomous art, for which I'm asking Piet Mondrian's work to stand as a kind of example. With his colleagues in European neoplasticism, Mondrian joined a long historical struggle on behalf of something called art for art's sake, an art that would be free of worn-out figuration. It would be free of religious iconography. It would be free of historical narrative. An art that could be understood by everyone without knowledge of myth or recourse to the artist's biography. Of course, this art would prove to be useful in important ways, as taken up by De-style architects or influencing Bauhaus design. But in 1943, when this was painted, titled Broadway Boogie Woogie, we would say that it was an instantiation of a kind of heroic autonomy. This would require bracketing off the allusions to Manhattan in its title, and I'll come back to that. It set a kind of a universal standard for purifying geometry in an emergently global modernity. But to hover on the date of this painting even briefly, 1943, allows us to point to the obvious context for its hard-won autonomy, a world at war, forcing Mondrian himself into exile in New York City. Less obviously, 1943 marked the first group show for a coming generation of very local Manhattan artists who would contest Mondrian's geometric abstraction, aspiring to another kind of globalism that was then popping into view for what was a sort of turbulent, late, symbol-laden painting of supposedly universal myths that looked like secondhand surrealism. And there was yet a third global optic being advocated during that transitional year of 1943, the aerial view of military surveillance celebrated in the MoMA exhibition, Airways for Peace, mounted by former Bauhäusler Herbert Bayer. Informing Bayer's inverted globe display was the pioneering cartographer Richard Estes Harrison, best known for his work illustrating Henry Luce's Fortune magazine down the street. In this capitalist magazine, the Airways vision touted by MoMA was given a Cold War gloss for the coming American century, either anxiously depicting Soviet views of Europe and Asia, or triumphantly evoking the vantage of the American pilot, who is master of these skies, and future markets, of course. Could there be an aerial, symbol-laden Mondrian that we might presently imagine to unite these 1943 versions of the global, whether in the horizontality of Lego, an animated fly-through, or the overview of conservation and preservation? Mondrian survives as an emblem of universal cultural value. The variant of these aerial Mondrians that I find most suggestive is the one on the upper right, made by a student who self-identifies as Vietnamese, Tung Pham, for his computer animation class at the Australian Design School, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. This was in 2010. We've indeed gone southeast to Asia, as Fortune and Richard Estes Harrison imagined, but what we discover there is the presence of Asians themselves, taking up the distributed universalism of an autonomous art. What this opening circumnavigation illustrates is the manner in which arguments for autonomy are always entangled with social mechanisms and distributive systems, never more so than when they serve a putatively universal form of specialized knowledge production, the nickname for which, as I've discussed, is art for art, or die Kunst für die Kunst. Yet the original French phrase, l'art pour l'art, was never remotely autonomous at all. It was part of a bureaucratic system formulated in the philosophy of Victor Cousin in 1830s Paris as the rationale for art's taxonomic insertion into the world pictures materializing during the expositions staged with regularity beginning in 1855 in that country. These expositions allocated to art its functional autonomy, but only as a gear in a large machine locking together all human knowledge. The entire assemblage intended to magnify the Universalist French Republic at the omphalos of engineer Frédéric Leplay's astonishing 1867 arrangement. And it was that image at the upper left which served as the poster for this talk. So I guess I'm positioned inside that narthex of the world. So autonomy is difficult to argue for any art inserted to such a complex assembly. But part of my operative thesis is that it was precisely such a condition that produced the need, indeed almost the urgency, for the ideology of autonomy. Take Pablo Picasso's Guernica, certainly now celebrated as a universal icon of modern art. Like Mondrian's canvas, this one is highly recognizable and certainly avant-garde. But how many recall that it was commissioned for the Spanish Republican Pavilion at the 1937 World's Fair in Paris, to be inserted, once again, into a highly operative world picture? The commissioning architect, José Luis Sert, had given Picasso carte blanche, and after the world's first aerial bombing firebombing of civilians by the German Luftwaffe at the small Basque village of Guernica in April, the artist had his theme. But when Sert's modest modernist pavilion opened, both painting and building were quite literally dwarfed by the so-called stone dragons of the competing Soviet and Nazi monoliths. Guernica, explicitly required to negotiate with such geopolitics, cannot easily be varnished with the romance of autonomy's brush. The risks of entering a world picture are great, and Guernica failed to emerge whatsoever in the overheated context of the fair. The only photograph I've been able to find in which the Spanish pavilion itself is even visible in the whole constellation of national pavilions is this one on the left. And you can see it's not very visible. So Sert's small modernist pavilion made of homicide and temporary materials opened many weeks late, which didn't help. Despite garnering some press coverage, its contributions to the fair were largely overlooked. The pavilion was not even included in the official album of photolithographs, for example, because, unlike the US or Egypt, its sponsoring government was actually a rump state embroiled in a civil war that Paris didn't want to exactly acknowledge. Thus, in order for Picasso's international strategies to fully unfold, his canvas had to get rolled up and go on tour. It went, among other places, to London in 1938, to Harvard's Fogg Art Museum in 1941, and in 1953 to the second edition of the New World Biennial in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This, in fact, is how it would become world famous. Because the painting was fully engaged in the global working of its art, imbricated in specific local politics wherever it landed, we might say that Guernica became the epitome of the anti-autonomous artwork. But these thoughts about autonomy need to be nuanced, since Guernica has always been held to carry an autonomy of content. That is, the painting is understood to carry a pure anti-war message that nonetheless evolves in each local situation. Picasso, Sert, and those who sent the painting on tour specifically aimed to rally support and, not incidentally, raise money for the Spanish Republicans. After the end of World War II, the canvas became an emblem of more general leftist anti-fascism, and finally it became a generic message promoting civilians' collective resistance to state-sponsored violence, as, for example, in protests against the Second Bush War, or contemporary websites that proclaim, "Gaza is our Guernica." In this ideologically constructed yet adaptable autonomy of content, Picasso's painting can be seen as universal and in some ways as autonomous in carrying its message as Mondrian. This helps me then theorize autonomy's global working as a function of art kind of working out from various political contexts, rather than a feature somehow embedded in the art itself. Here I briefly show you the painting in art history inside the Art Museum in New York. True, the artist's formal choices, Mondrian's choices, reinforce his painting's transcendental qualities. His canvas is non-objective. That is, it does not depict anything in its abstraction. Its careful brushstrokes convey impersonality, refusing the autographic gesture. Although many of the lines visually extend past the edge of the canvas, the colors do not stray from the pure primaries, red, yellow, and blue, laid down in syncopated visual rhythms. When we think of the painting's title, we can interpret this visual syncopation as a deft analogy to the acoustics of jazz, dancing through the Manhattan city grid that's implied by Mondrian's abstract canvas. Yet both Boogie Woogie and Broadway were ignored in readings of this painting in 1943. The most important mid-century critic writing in America, Clement Greenberg, whom I can only pray you've never heard of, decided that Mondrian's work was a beacon of technocratic universal modernism, and in that very autonomy would become morally capable of repairing what Greenberg identified as the decor of the modern world. What of it we see, move in, and handle. This global formula was built into Greenberg's own apartment, into his habitus. This habitus favored colorful, hard-edged, non-objective abstraction, celebrated through the art historical method of formalism, favoring a cool, light, uncluttered way of living, as we see in this 1967 photograph taken for Vogue magazine, where this epistemic configuration could be recommended to the international readership of Condé Nast. For someone in my generation, formalism was intellectually thrilling, but it failed to capture the gritty agency of art in the world. Formalism ignored both the problems society was asking art to solve and the problematic world pictures in which art objects were being situated throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The path of encumbrance, of viewers and artists grappling with world pictures, of producers leveraging art's autonomy for other forms of agency, political and otherwise, was a part of art's history. Picasso indeed wanted these encumbrances. He was fully willing to insert his work into Sartre's desperate propaganda machine, made for Spaniards, by a Spaniard, to be seen by people of the world. But at the same time, let us recall how Picasso equipped this particular portable object, using canny strategies of universalism and non-specificity. Let's look closely at these strategies, since they gloss over the particularities of the German airstrike on a small Basque village, to produce, I suggest, something we might want to think of as a global work of art. The first strategy is Picasso's grayed-out palette, mimicking documentary newsprint and news photographs, but in generic and completely illegible ways. Second, Picasso crafts his figures to allude to a classical past, with fallen warriors and wounded horses rather than burn victims of the German Luftwaffe. Third, the artist's overall narrative emphasizes the bombing's impact on women and children rather than Republican militiamen, with the whole anchored by a pyramidal composition that dates back to the Renaissance, nested within allusions to the medieval triptych of religious paintings. Finally, Picasso's strategies of universalism include the iconography of barbarity versus enlightenment, slightly updated to form a torch in one person's hand that becomes a light bulb at the center of the painting, the lone signifier of modernity in this painted and portable mural. Guernica, then, was made as a consciously timeless painting, generalized widely for worldly significance, wielding this kind of universalism to smooth over local difference and specificity. It rendered a particular Basque town generic in order to propagate beyond Spain and mean something globally, and it avoided placement in a nation for many years. For me, it's crucial that such tactics were instigated for and propelled outward by a World's Fair. This allows me to state a central argument of this talk tonight, making it explicit. The fair system structured a set of imperatives to which artists and others had to adjust. Fairs were knowledge-making machines and comparison factories. Fairs and biennials produced new subjects for art, prompting new tactics by artists who aspired to a new global conversation. It is this history of worldly entanglement, of engagement despite claims to autonomy, and of the actual working of the art that I aim to tell. The overall project of which this research grew out of constituted a history from the present, driven by a contemporary art world saturated with biennials and their artworks, and those artworks are often deeply woven into specific sites. The art is often explicitly non-autonomous, invoking local politics, the body, alternative sensory paths for the so-called visual arts. Contemporary artists who tend to show in these biennial venues join their activated viewers in pursuing a set of practices I call biennial culture. How did we get from modernism's portable objects and discourse of autonomy to installation art's entangled relational and embodied aesthetics? In this book, I argue for a deeper past undergirding such a present, and my arguments entail their own method. Not as pure as formalism, my toolkit builds from close readings to ask after internal dynamics, global forces, local receptions, embodied experiences, partial views, and transformed subjects. So I ask, for example, what in Saikwo-gang's cultural melting bath on the right calls to earlier histories of tourism and exotic entertainments in the World's Fair? How in Mariko Mori's brainwave alteration pod, Wave UFO on the left with yours truly, are the technological wonders of the 19th century's Hall of Machines extended to the art world and made personal and intimate? When does embodiment cut against the virtual, as in the lush and sensual imagery of Pippolati Risk projected onto the ceiling of a 16th century Venetian church, airborne imagery that we observe from comfy lounge beds below? Biennial culture's increasingly global art world of contemporary event-driven art experiences are theorized by the likes of sociologist and curator Nicolas Bourriaud to constitute a new episteme, where situational and relational aesthetics have transformed our very understanding of the way art works on us. As a historian, however, I'm suspicious to claims of sudden change. I want to understand the debt we bear to centuries of world picturing spectacles and practices in promoting such an aesthetics of experience. Much like the World's Fairs and the Biennale that came to follow them, the contemporary art world engages tourism, play, ephemerality, exoticism, and the art market. These are worldly attributes that make art history as an academic practice rather uncomfortable. But the fairs also provoked viewers' self-improving education. And I have a whole separate thing about this weird neoclassical sculpture on the left, which got involved in abolitionist performances in London and in tours around the American South. So that's the kind of complication that I'm talking about. So, you know, this viewer was also meant to improve themselves, to educate themselves, to develop their critical skills in these theaters of the world. Cultural transformations were held to be at hand, providing a powerful platform for art to conduct politics by other means. And of course, I'm dying to know what people here thought of the Salcedo. So in the question and answer period, you can tell me. This, I believe, we need to grapple with to understand the challenges and synergies of this art world, or we're not doing proper art history of the contemporary. We need to ask why visitors come to these recurring exhibitions in the first place, and why they're not content with what can be seen in museums or conventional art galleries, but seek in the biennial experience and immersion. Now, the darker history of this can, of course, be connected to the experience economy, first theorized by German sociologist in a highly critical book, Gerhard Schulze, in 1992. I need to grab this. And then later announced in the Harvard Business Review's completely praising account by Joseph Pine and James Gilmore in 1998. But this experience economy also has a much longer history. So even as the Grand Tour was democratized by London's first great exhibition, Thomas Cook was stimulated to invent the world's first package tour. Fairs drove urban infrastructures, becoming aspects of the city brandscapes recently theorized by architect Anna Klingman in 2007. News in 2013 that a Shanghai real estate firm was interested in rebuilding the Crystal Palace in London only confirms this trajectory of the simulacral. My colleagues in the fields of art and architectural history have tended to address the situation with understandable melancholy, not to say monochrome. In books of critical reflection such as Pam Lee's Forgetting the Art World or David Joslett's After Art, notice the iconoclastic covers. These friends of mine in Anglo-American art history are thus grappling with globalization, but sometimes with a desire to reestablish autonomy as the precondition for artistic agency, or the defended protector of artistic freedom and artistic speech. I'm arguing from history that autonomy is a hard-won product of entanglement. Moreover, I claim that tangling with world pictures is an important precondition for a critically global working of the art. This is, of course, a situation of strongly local interest, with the ongoing success of your Istanbul Biennial at hand. Since this is my first visit to Istanbul, I don't want that up there yet, I'm unequipped to see how these dynamics work out in your local, highly cosmopolitan enclave. It will be incredibly interesting to me to learn from you some observations about these structures in the Q&A period. So, my own recently published book, The Global Work of Art, openly theorizes my own limitations as a Euro-American art historian, educated and located in North America. The work I praise as critical globalist artwork propels a positionality within this provincialism, a position that works out in what I call a politics of the partial view. In other words, to digress a little bit, the artworks that interest me are artworks that make me aware of my own incapacity to fully understand where the artist came from, but to possibly understand some translational position that he or she is occupying, right? This idea of our own self-awareness as located and partial is part of the politics that I enjoy in this globalized art world. So, the larger history that I advocate in this global work of art book calls for exploring such positionality in granular detail, while somehow also keeping track of this bird's eye view that's a kind of obsession about these world pictures that they consistently elicit. How is knowledge produced in such overwhelming assemblies? Doesn't art get lost in the shuffle? Through the critical parallax of different scales and comparative histories, it becomes clear that these event-driven modes of engaging the viewer were one place that autonomy could become a value in the first place, partnered by the professionalization of the art market and of art history itself. This was all going on simultaneously. Artistic strategies of specialized address, I'm saying, were forged in the crucible of the fairs, woven into the world picturing being done by expositions and stimulating artists' own urgent response and sense of involvement in this development. Consider briefly the juxtaposition I put before you. A cartographer's imagined bird's eye view of the 1867 World Exposition in Paris, and a canvas depicting that very event by the great modernist Edouard Manet. Manet, who was excluded from the official Beaux-Arts pavilion at this exposition, mimicked Gustave Courbet's tactic from the previous Paris fair and borrowed money from his friends and patrons to set up his very own pavilion. Aiming at the fair's 15 million visitors, he painted quite a few of them into this canvas. His painting ignores the fair's official taxonomies to produce its own universal exposition of the human types in Paris for the fair, reinforcing artistic tropes of the cosmopolitan center where all the world comes to see and be seen. What is the demographic that Manet brings out of his bird's eye view and into ours? Well, the population here includes an immigrant worker who's been hired to maintain the newly planted fairgrounds, a plump bourgeois lady next to a cocotte with her chaperone in black, 2 British country tourists gawking at Nadar's globe-shaped hot air balloon, an Amazon, or liberated woman, on her horse, 2 Parisian gentlemen, 3 off-duty imperial guards, And finally, Manet's own son, Léon, promenading with the family dog, here on the right. Exemplary historians such as Pat Minardi and T.J. Clark have noted the painting's odd disjunctions and curiously unfinished qualities, testaments, as they say, to the fragmentary gaze of a distracted modern flaneur. But what interests me as much as that is how this art worked as part of Manet's tactics to solicit the gaze and create a public at the fair, out in the world and not just provincial Paris. The International Fair offered him a platform from which to offer an alternative to the conservatism of his local academy and cultural establishment. As the artist himself put it in a pamphlet that he sold for entrance to this pavilion, to exhibit is the vital issue, the sine qua non for the artist, for it so happens after several confrontations that one becomes familiar with what had been surprising and, if you will, shocking. Little by little, one understands it and accepts it. To exhibit is to find friends and allies for the struggle. So remember, this is an ostentatiously anti-official pavilion that the artist has set up. This finding of an audience, this creating of allies and friends for the struggle, was a challenge, but Manet was suggesting it was the only way to proceed if you had desires for the global. And I'm interested in whether such tactics can be connected to those taken by artists today. Is the struggle Manet describes one of formal innovation only? Or as in the Cypriot expat Hussein Chalayan's 2005 video installation for the nation of Turkey at the Venice Biennale, might such strategies of insertion use the tiny Archimedean lever of art to shift discourse to another level? Chalayan's theme was the polyglot diversity of humanity, a theme that resonated in the wider context of an imminent vote in the European community on Turkey joining the EU in a post-9/11 world. If fairs and biennials conduct politics by other means, then can art be seen to work its own kind of agency in that assemblage, earning its autonomy and freedom to speak, while potentially operating outside the art world in other gears of politics as well? Well, obviously such questions sort of haunted this book, The Global Work of Art, of which this talk is a kind of general overview. The idea was that art would form a verb. Art would not be an object anymore, but would be seen to be actively working in the world. Crowded into this slide are images spanning the kind of history that I wanted to tell from the 19th century World's Fairs, here exemplified by anarchist geographer Elisée Reclus' terrestrial globe installed next to the Eiffel Tower at the 1900 Exposition Universelle in Paris, extending to the 21st century artist Mona Hatoum with her glowing sculpture Hotspots at the 2007 Sharjah Biennale. In the history I'm exploring, the biennial format developed by Venice in 1895 forms a kind of crux or midpoint, the city positioning itself as the inheritor of the exhausted energies of the fair, to refute that exhausted encyclopedic impulse with a recurring, perpetually renewing, trade-specific art fair that was also a branding strategy for this cosmopolitan city that was much older than its own upstart nation. So Venice wanted to position itself as a kind of cosmopolitan gateway to a world that the Rome, capital, nation of Italy, was dying to position itself in relation to. So this brilliant urban intervention was copied half a century later by Sao Paulo, transplanting the format to a new world in a Cold War. After the Brazilian intervention, Biennale proliferated around the world almost instantly. Countries said, wait, you can do that? It's not just Venice? And there was, a Franco collaboration with Batista to do, Hispanic biennial in Cuba. I mean, it was just a crazy proliferation. So the sheer number of these biennials is astounding. And to give you a sense, I want to play this animation created by a curator from Eastern Europe, Rafał Nemeczewski. And it should be just sort of counting down as I speak. The growth of biennials that Nemeczewski has graphed through 2007 somewhat parallels population growth, but is more indicative, I suggest, of the spreading nodes of networked globalization itself. Such a situation requires a structural taxonomic understanding rather than a nominative history. The stakes of my project, then, are to craft a synoptic history that's nonetheless punctuated by detailed case studies and close readings that can explore our desires for world pictures and interrogate the global subjects they produce. So towards that end, I'm going to delve into this rather peculiar case that I hope will be stimulating and interesting. So at the midpoint of this talk, I'm going to dig into the case of Joseph Israels with a primary goal of restoring work to its sort of active function as a verb. Although not nearly as glamorous as Manet or Courbet or Picasso, the painter Joseph Israels provides me with an interesting case study. His career begins with the very first fair to have had a fine arts pavilion and ends shortly after the founding of the Venice Biennale. Crucially for my argument, Israels cropped up into my awareness in a catalog of the fair as the Dutch Millet, a configuration that I've dubbed predicated internationalism, which has many avatars, including the Pakistani Picasso, and so on. Perhaps we can get to that concept in the Q&A. In any case, the major thesis of the book, which Israels helps me to argue, is philosophical, something I call blind epistemology, in which, set up by Plato, Descartes, and Diderot, these powerful philosophers claimed by Europe and for Europe, in the case of the Greek philosopher Plato, the trope of blindness recurs over and over in the critiques of the fairs, from Henry Adams to Marcel Duchamp. These Western visitors to the fairs turn away from the spectacle and from the rows of objects and columns of text to become sensory investigators, tapping through the archives and cabinets of artifacts to conduct their own kind of tender empiricism, as Goethe identified it. In Henry Adams' powerful simile, the pen serves as a blind man's staff, leading him through the fairs. The second thesis of the book is historical and argues that the fairs over time enforce certain rules of the game. Players, that is, artists, could enter this theater of nations and would have to learn to speak a kind of international language, but in adopting that language, they would need to be constrained to speak of difference, usually their own, hence the Dutch Millet. The best artists became strategists of this condition. They anticipate that knowledge is plural, their position will be translated, that one aspect will appear salient within the international art world, where another will communicate to the artist's culture of origin. These tactics evolve over time and must be worked out by each artist entering the melee at any given historical moment. So the case of Joseph Israels leapt out at me from the European archives as exemplary of these mechanisms. In other words, I just had a hunch that if I followed this guy, I would find how these things operated. Becoming international in 1855 at the Paris World's Fair with this giant painting, Israels was appointed to the founding committee of the Venice Biennale. I don't know what happened to his head. I think something in the USB transfer erased it. I hope that's the only slide where this is going on. Very odd indeed. So, becoming international in 1855 at this Paris World's Fair, he was appointed to the founding committee of the Venice Biennale and was awarded a gold medal for lifetime achievement at the 1900 Exposition Universelle in Paris. In other words, this guy was a total success. Yet it's probable that despite this fair certified fame in his lifetime, you may have never heard of him. This case then brings into focus the question of forgotten internationalisms, how one epoch's universal language becomes obsolete in less than a generation. With a name, of course, that marks his difference from Christian Europe, Israels was born in Guernica to a family of traders who kept ties to relatives in Germany, but blossomed in their adopted Dutch community, founding there a synagogue, a mikveh, and a cemetery. Resisting his father's calls to become a businessman, young Israels passed the state exams for the Royal Art Academy in Amsterdam, where he learned a smooth, polished history painting style that you see here in this painting that he entered into the fair. He studied in Amsterdam under Jan Willem Pieneman And here we see Pieneman's 1824 canvas of a triumphant Wellington presiding at the Dutch-British-German victory over the French Napoleon at Waterloo. Israels was encouraged by teachers such as Pieneman to go to the true center of the 19th century art world, so he traveled to Paris in 1844, where he studied with academician François-Édouard Picot, who brought the French standard of the nude into Israel's repertoire. Cutting this transfer of skills abruptly short, the 1848 revolution forced Israels back to Amsterdam. And, you know, there's another moment where he studies in Paris with Ari Scheffer, but something may have happened to that. Oh, no, that turned up. Good. So, you know, I hope you're now kind of blinded by all this academic, these mountains of flesh. This cluttered view of Israel's artistic biography becomes much simpler when we narrow our focus to the paintings selected for the World's Fair Dutch section in 1855, namely this one in the background of all this, William of Orange. This academic history painting was made after Israels had supposedly mastered all of these teachers' lessons. His massive oil, William of Orange meeting with Margaretha of Parma, was not even finished when it was selected for inclusion in the Dutch pavilion. Must have been a super exciting moment. The 1855 Parisian Fair was to depart from its British model, the Great Exhibition, by featuring a display dedicated exclusively to the fine arts. The stakes could not have been higher for a young foreigner entering this brand new international venue for comparison, the competing nation's best art, right? Israel's earnest attempt, I mean, we have to say, is rather overworked and lugubrious, but we can see the operative standards that were at play well enough. Remember the unspoken rules of the game, as I've articulated them. The artwork should speak some kind of international language, which is here academic history painting, but should use it to speak of difference, in this case, the history of the Netherlands. The event being shown is a 16th century meeting between William of Orange, the Protestant-born, Catholic-raised favorite of Charles V, and Margaretha of Parma, who's regent of the Netherlands because she's the half-sister to the Habsburg Emperor Philip II. This is deep history. Although she was Philip's designated ruler in the Low Countries, Margaretha had no army. Hence, she had to negotiate with the Protestant Prince William, the ruling stadtholder and spokesman for the local noblemen and their militias. The frozen moment that this tableau records occurred in April of 1565 when Margaretha was presented with a petition from the noblemen demanding an end to the Spanish persecution of local Protestants. All right, so this is a theater around the Inquisition. As Israels wrote to a friend, this moment seemed, quote, really interesting as a subject to represent the fatherland. Because, and I have a quote here, will we see it? Yes. Because William was so secretive that for many, no one knew how he was taking the advice from the open council chosen by the party of the people, until with a single gesture, he declined to follow the edicts of Philip, right? Okay, so he's the populist, representing the will of the local people against the Spanish Inquisition. So with a foot in the two warring Christian faiths, Protestantism and Catholicism, William represents for Israel's reason and tolerance, a rather moving topic. His raised hand makes a commanding gesture of restraint that can also be read as a kind of blessing or a promise of grace. A grid placed over the picture reveals the hierarchies at play. Margaretha and her courtiers are linked in indecision, while William commands them from above, supported warily by the diplomat to our left and more courageously by the soldier on the right. The Catholic Margaretha sits forward in her almost liturgical throne, swathed in the fabrics of court luxury, while William stands calmly in sober Protestant black under a frame of neoclassical architecture, his posture conveying rhetorical power and Ciceronian restraint. Notice that the orange, e.g. Protestant William in Israel's painting, is not the warrior he would later be in life, who would be thrown into martyrdom by a French Catholic assassin, which was actually the first political killing in human history to be accomplished with a gun. What Israel's and the curator of the Dutch section who visited his studio in 1854 wanted to put into the world picture was not such an obviously incendiary moment, but a specific one. The painting depicts this moment in history that might remind the French, who by now have another Napoleon in charge, that tolerance and pacifism are the Dutch contributions to the Enlightenment, emblems of ground-level politics and secular coexistence that are being lobbed into Catholic imperial France. The goals of knowledge production are simple: be impressed by the Dutch and by their specific representative, the young unknown, first-generation Dutchman, Joseph Israels. Well, we can only imagine how the artist must have swelled with excitement as he imagined his painting being viewed by thoughtful men in the world in the Beaux-Arts Pavilion, offering a contemplative lesson quite apart from the minstrelry of nations cartooned and the racks of gaudy commercial goods so typical of this rather new form of exhibition. But what interests me more is what Israel saw when he actually made it to Paris to view the painting in the Beaux-Arts Pavilion. As he entered the separate pavilion, he would have seen something like this: a dense hanging familiar from the seasonal Paris salons, recorded in one of the world's first installation photographs. And I want you to notice the shadowy ladder, because film emulsions are too slow to capture the moving humans, but they do capture the relatively still ladder in the middle of the room, which is being used to hang the show. In this setup, French artists were in the main galleries that you came into first, and les étrangers are somewhere in the back. Apparently, the Dutch didn't fare so well in the implied contest. One historian reported that reviews were, quote, not good for the Dutch entry and for history painting as practiced by Israels, end quote. The painter himself later recalled being dismayed when he saw his canvas in Paris, writing a friend, "I regret that the tableau had not gotten better." Somehow magically getting better as it left his studio. Israels was impressed all over again by the academician Thomas Couture's Romans of the Decadence, a canvas that was already 8 years old, but still dominated the French section with its admonitory judgment on imperial excess. As photographs show, the interior of the French section was stuffed from top to bottom with the eclectic fruits of the academic Beaux-Arts tradition, ranging from icy old Ingres to Rosa Bonheur's prize-winning earthy haymaking. But all of this came to seem staggeringly irrelevant, for just outside the Beaux-Arts building proper was the ambitious realist pavilion mounted by Gustave Courbet, right down the street and on every artist's lips. The sheer audacity of mounting your own pavilion, seemingly in confrontation with the state apparatus of an entire world picture, certainly contributed to Courbet's success, and this was the model that Manet wanted to mimic. But it's important to note that the entire enterprise was hardly opposed by the state. The pavilion's location alone at 7 Avenue Montaigne suggests its semi-official status. It was de facto endorsed by Napoleon III as a way of currying populist sentiment while snubbing the elitist academy. Paralleling this endorsement, Courbet embedded a flattering portrait of the self-appointed emperor into his major canvas at the middle of the pavilion, depicting this guy, whom you see here in a photograph, Napoleon III, as he named himself, depicting him as a huntsman inside his monumental painting, The Artist's Studio, which was, as I say, the centerpiece of this pavilion. We have to imagine paintings like this hitting the young Israels like a slap in the face. A paradoxical fusion of academic allegory and everyday people, with no great moments of history, no obvious narrative, and only tenebrous brushstrokes to knit these motley contemporary figures together in a tableau centered on the artistic genius at work. Realist, of course, but not realistic. As Linda Nochlin and Meyer Shapiro have explored, Courbet's monumentalization of vulgarity was proudly explicit in this and other paintings in his pavilion, with the artist alluding to cheap popular broadsides of the wandering Jew as a figure for his own self-identity as a prophet confronting the decadent urban bourgeoisie. How much of this could have been known to Israels is unclear, but certainly he would have grasped the pavilion's polemical function, the style of realism that had been appropriated from literature as the new model for visual art. And of course, Courbet's shocking new mode of featuring regular people from the present day, as well as himself, as the subject matter for monumental painting, dominated, of course, by the artist's own self-aggrandizing portraits of his genius. The style's supposed ugliness, which was written about by critics of the time, was perceived as both political and populist in the wake of the failed 1848 revolution. The radical pictorial lessons in the realist pavilion included turning away from the city with its erudition and intellectualism and history, to depict those left behind by industrialization, anonymized by its displacements. These new subjects of realism were applauded by socialists such as Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who commented, "Courbet's painting is an irony directed against our industrialized civilization, which is incapable of freeing man from the heaviest, most difficult, most unpleasant tasks, the eternal lot of the poor." Perhaps most salient to the young Israels was that in order to depict his humble workers, Courbet had turned to a particular art historical precedent, Dutch 17th century genre paintings, with a new kind of crusty materiality that only added to their visceral modernity. Courbet's temporary pavilion would have upended everything that Israels had been taught by his academic masters. They had valued history and classical reference, polished with skill, erudition, and varnish, notions they had themselves imported from the dominant French Academy. In reckoning with Courbet, Israels would have had to go back to the old demotic language of Netherlandish genre painting, enlarged, of course, to a massive scale and anonymized into hieratic universality. Well, this was asking a lot of Israels. He had worked hard to get where he was, and indeed, upon his return to the Netherlands from visiting the exposition, he plunged into crisis. Or at least this is the romantic transformation that his historiography contains. The artist who now fully understood his provinciality could resolve his crisis only by becoming blind to the fair. He could only work out the impact of this world picture by locating the politics of his own partial view, the provincial but authentic reality of where he was standing. Seeing official knowledge so fulsomely displayed on the one hand and so completely demolished by Courbet on the other, set up a stunning new imperative for Israels to be contemporary in a new way. Immediately evident in works such as Israel's painting Alongside the Cemetery from 1856, we see the young artist taking up in his own way Courbet's Gauntlet, producing a genre painting of the seaside proletariat, monumentalized to tragic proportions. The tale of Israel's crisis and transformation reinforces tropes of artistic development and traumatic knowledge production that have endured in Western art history, certainly since Vasari's Lives of the Artist in the 16th century. Thus we read in the first Venice Biennial catalog, 4 decades after this painting was made, that the young provincial Israel learned the falsità della sua educazione, the falsity of his development, only by going to cosmopolitan Paris. After confronting this falsity in his training, he is said to have fallen dangerously ill, taking himself for a rest cure to the North Sea coast in Zandvoort, about 10 miles from Amsterdam. Here, turning from urbanity, as had Courbet, he made the studies that were later summoned to paint something like this. A totem of Israel's new faith in the facture and politics of international realism, inflected by local difference. And of course, he's making it international realism, right? Because he's taking it from Paris to the Netherlands. Zandvoort, it turned out, was perfect for this transformative alchemy, offering Israels a sharp contrast between the humble fisherfolk who lived there and the fashionable tourists who were beginning to flock to this developing bathing resort. In this context, the artist split the difference between Courbet's striding self-portrait, which you see on the bottom, and the humble, toiling father and son of the stonebreakers, who were now given a baby and a religion, and all situated amidst the particular scenography of the Dutch seacoast. The new mode became so successful that Israel's is now best known for scenes like these of humble fisherfolk, including another tableau about death that would win accolades in the London World's Fair of 1862, becoming a celebrated acquisition at Britain's National Gallery. Here the comparison would be not to Courbet's Meeting, but to another painting from that 1855 Pavillon du Réalisme, Courbet's vast Burial at Ornans, with its horizontal frieze of figures merging with the landscape and grappling with death. These homologies with Courbet go amazingly unmentioned in the literature about Israel's. Recall that it's Israel's fate not to become the Dutch Courbet, but the Dutch Millet. Why this linkage? The short answer is that Jean-François Millet offered a better market. Millet was avowedly a realist, but one more palatable to the world market as well as the French state. Casual globe-trotting collectors were bewildered by Courbet's strange pictures and radical politics. Millet was more easily comprehended and consumed. Interestingly, many of Millet's early adopters came from the intellectual circles in my own hometown of Boston, led by the artist William Morris Hunt, who purchased Millet's more difficult early painting, The Sower, which was already in Boston by 1851. Thus, it had been painted and collected before the great exhibitions created their own kind of world pictures and changed the game. Once Millet entered those world's fairs, however, his style radically changed. His gaze softened, and he began to emphasize his affiliation with the palatable tradition of Netherlandish genre painting, rather than the socialist sympathies evident in Sower, a shift that further increased his appeal for the world's collectors. In this more tepid later realism, honesty, warmth, and directness were still valued above academic art's polish, but brushstrokes would now be smaller, contrasts would be softened, and the color template would shift to the rosy end of the spectrum. If Millet would learn to anonymize labor from Courbet, he would also domesticate it. Courbet was a communard, painting the urban proletariat. Millet painted the rural poor in ways that could reinforce the message of Jesus. The poor you shall always have with you. Biblical allusions were certainly available in Millet's one entry to that 1855 exposition. Following a thorough state evaluation of his political leanings in 1852, the artist had been approved by his own government for a state commission and was, in this sense, pre-vetted for the important venue of the fair. He was allowed to submit one painting, and the painting he submitted is a veritable holy family. As one historian describes it, for peasant grafting a tree, exhibited in the World's Fair of 1855, Millet tempered his usual brutal realism, perhaps in response to government pressure to display non-controversial themes for this international audience, end quote. This, then, was Millet as the conciliatory Barbizon realist rather than the brutal portraitist of the poor. The marketable French artist to whom the Dutch-dwelling Israels would be so consistently compared, a predicated internationalism that it seems Israel's himself desired. Or at least this is the implication of the anecdote reported by the young Max Liebermann, a secessionist who wrote of his old friend, the senior painter Israels, in 1901, Israels once said to me, "No painter except Millet has been less able to draw and paint than I, and yet made such good pictures." In other words, like Millet, Israels is not a man of talent, but a genius, end quote. Cottage Madonna confirms that this was a genius of place, genius loci, honoring the tutelary god of Dutchness. What I want to emphasize here is that a painter such as Israels, who was a beneficiary of Europe's tenuously secular enlightenment, a talented youngster from an immigrant family, enabled by bureaucracies of the state to find his way into international competition, this Israels had to learn his innocence, his common touch, and his channeling of a largely Christian fatherland in order to enter the international fray. The world picture, in other words, is hardly universal, though it is universalist. That Israel's achieved this synthesis was confirmed by an anecdote reported by a U.S. critic in 1912. Quote, "When the Archbishop of Paris saw his cottage Madonna in the 1882 Paris Salon, he said to the eminent Jew, 'Mr. Israels, you are a great Catholic,'" end quote. This astonishing accolade of acceptance by hegemonic Christianity was narrated by Frank Gonzalez, who was a Chicago pastor, educator, art collector, and writer, just one of the many Midwesterners in the U.S. who collected Israel's work. Doubtless Gonzalez got the story from Israel's himself. And we might understand the Catholic in this anecdote to be spelled with a lowercase c, where you could actually fudge whether it was Protestant Christianity or Catholic Christianity. The kind of cosmopolitanism that presupposed a kind of universality that comes from Augustine's City of God. In other words, anyone can belong to the City of God as long as you accept Christ. Thus, Israel's worldliness is not a critical globalism that pushes back against the forces of globalization. It is instead an emblem of the rules as they functioned for the 19th century artist in a spreading market that included reproductions authorized by the artist and others, such as these posthumously flooding across Europe and into the US, where they land in drifts in the industrial Midwest and along the eastern seaboard of North America. The marketing of Israel's via Millet is reinforced even by contemporary websites such as Britain's National Gallery, in which this painting is dutifully celebrated as being redolent of Millet. But despite this repetition of the trope, it was actually a group of British critics, historically, who questioned the Francophone insistence on Israel's as a Dutch Millet, as witnessed in the puzzle tone of this 1912 art writer. Quote, "To regard Israel's as being a kind of interpreter of Millet to Holland is not in accordance with the facts. Though Millet was 10 years older than Israel's, he had only just left the studio of Delaroche when the latter entered it. The year Millet painted the first of his great peasant pictures, The Winnower, was the year that Israel's left Paris, soon to come to his awakening at Sanford. In 1857, Israel's exhibited at the Paris Salon 2 seashore pictures. In 1859, Millet's Death and the Woodcutter was rejected at the Salon." And here's the key part of the quote, my favorite part. "If we call Israel's the Dutch Millet, it must be by way of comparison, not of affiliation, and we must be at liberty to call Millet the French Israel's." End quote. But of course, we are not at liberty in this way. As my case study has endeavored to show, our interpretive liberty will always be shaped by the world picturing apparatus and the structuring of knowledge that it produces, enforcing a predicated internationalism from the centers of power. Here, Israel's as the Dutch Millet, because art history is being written in French, by French people, by the chronicler of Paris's 1900 Exposition Universelle, right? This is how it gets written. And I've struggled to point out that Israel's was perfectly happy to accept the rules of this game. The list of his paintings that made it into world pictures and widely distributed collections is completely remarkable, evincing a success equal to any biennial artist operating today in its balance of market and academy, exposition and fair. If we imagine that today's biennials are guarantors of an enduring reputation in art history, the case of Israel's has another cautionary lesson to offer. A successful lifetime career in these events does not necessarily guarantee an enduring legacy. But that is the topic of another talk altogether. Let me approach my conclusion with a recap of the historical thesis. Artists who will enter the world picture must adopt the prevailing international language and use it to speak of difference. They will often be the subjects of a predicated internationalism and be inserted into the art world discourse solely through their relations to established canonical artists determined by the centralized country producing and dominating art world discourse. And that shifts, of course, but it's pretty powerful. What I've attempted to show is the artist's own participation in this game, which, given Israel's present obscurity, is clearly not always successful beyond his lifetime. Potentially, a given artist will be gifted enough to expand and extend a prevalent international style, perhaps even stretching it to set a new norm. A brilliant tactician might reveal the centralized style's debt to a peripheralized other, or might generalize from an enforced difference to craft a strategically universalized message. And I have read Picasso's Guernica in this way. Such maneuvers may require relocation to a center, and note, Israel's was not willing to make that move. He accepted terms that Picasso also would later refuse. For these very reasons, Israel's can exemplify a kind of normal art in its global working, and here I'm analogizing that concept to what Thomas Kuhn once dubbed in such withering ways, normal science. But in his small way, I want to leave you with this idea that Israel's did keep alive, for Dutch artists, the validity of their own tradition, rediscovering it via Courbet and Millet, and bringing it back to salience in the theaters of realism, which all of these characters were staging at the World's Fairs, where that kind of circulation of the Dutch genre tradition could become contemporary again, first through Israel's perhaps, but also later via the much younger Dutchman Vincent van Gogh, who obediently described Israel's in a letter to his brother Theo as the Dutch Millet. I'm even tempted to see a dim echo of Israel's peripheral themes surviving to occupy the center of Picasso's Guernica. In the lone signifier that these are modern people, the light bulb, Picasso himself, borrows from the dark background and primitive interior lighting of Van Gogh. And so we come in a kind of full circle. Via Van Gogh's own adoption of Israel's to the peaceful comforts of home and interiority violently ruptured by industrial world war. In this mobile modernism, world pictures have certainly played their part. So the assertions I began with will organize my brief conclusion and will bring us back to the present. I'm claiming that the structural circumstances of artists' insertions into recurring world-picturing exhibitions have a history stretching the length and breadth of modernity. The structures of knowledge production in these venues are consistent over centuries. They move from purpose-built temples and fairgrounds to emptied industrial structures that were themselves once part of modern capital's expansion and circulation, now repurposed for post-industrial urban development in the experience economy. Likewise, the media suffusing our world pictures have changed from the once stable typologies of sculpture, paint, and paper to the more open-ended media of video installation, performance, and constructed situations. But nonetheless, these have all been designed to produce experience in the contemporary subject. The questions that linger are these. Have the tropes identified in the earlier world pictures changed all that much? Visitors today may be invited to enter Si's cultural melting bath rather than look at a picture or a sculpture, but one wonders again at the marks of difference being represented or consumed. Experience, which once included taking a bone-rattling train trip to see a piece of sculpture with the promise of a sculpted Greek slave and a cup of imported tea at its end, may now be bundled into a total sensory package at the Biennial itself, by immersion in a diasporal Chinese artist's bath of steaming medicinal herbs. So in the final analysis, though, I want to hold off the collapse of all expositionary art into a late capitalist experience economy. I'm insisting on desires, for example, to allow us to try and hold on to the murmur of the crowd in contemporary discourse formation. The desires of people are to go to these world pictures. I think we have to take account of those. And by pluralizing desires, I take a further nod in the direction of the polyvocality we know is hiding in the universal. What about the world pictures that are summoned by these desires for the global that we still experience when we go to these overwhelming events? Are they merely instruments of the state entities, municipal boosters, and diffuse NGOs that propel world's fairs and drive biennial culture? Given philosophical heft by Martin Heidegger, the concept of the Weltbild, or world picture, has its own history that precedes this philosopher and a more diffuse existence after him. For Heidegger, this inherited anthropological concept of world picturing became a singular affair. This now singular world picture marked for him a new and terrifying epistemic moment, characteristic of modernity. It was the sign of the break between a prelapsarian world of wholeness and a modern tyranny of hegemonic representation. I argue, however, that Heidegger's vision of a singular epoch in which a world picture becomes possible and indeed enforced is itself epistemically fueled by the world pictures authorized by the empire of affairs. I can only allude to this argument here, but let me just remind you that the young Heidegger not only converted Wilhelm Dilthey's Weltanschauung into Weltbild, but did so expressly to deliver a blow to French universalism, conceiving of his text on the world picture as a speech he planned to deliver at the International Congress of Philosophy that was being conceived and convened in Paris at the 1937 World's Fair. So picture Picasso's Guernica hovering down there, and then imagine what it would have been like to have Heidegger at a podium across the Champ de Mars. All right, so in this famous theorization of the age of the world picture, Heidegger made a decisive and restrictive interpretation of Dilthey's turn-of-the-century concept of Erlebnis, a kind of lived experience that was meant to resist what Dilthey himself called ocularism, in favor of what Dilthey wanted, an openness of being and becoming, which Dilthey held possible even amidst the onslaught of modernity. So this openness is the world picturing activity that I want. I want to adapt this from Dilthey, and I want to expand this from Heidegger's almost paranoid restrictions to a single Weltbild. And I want to add to this Erlebnis, this lived experience, I want to add Erfahrung, the accumulated experience that comes upon reflection to the being that art becomes. As a final example of how I use this expanded concept of an accumulated reflective experience in assessing world-making art, let us look for a moment at a few contemporary artists such as Willem Boshoff and his Blind Alphabet, a work that was commissioned for the first Johannesburg Biennial and has been shown in several others. Briefly, the work exhibits the polyvocality I've been advocating. The sighted visitor sees only an arrangement of minimalist boxes, which in standard art decorum they may not touch. By contrast, the blind visitor and blind interpreters, who are often hired to come and hang around this work of art, are allowed to lift the box covers, read the Braille explanations within, and touch the sculptures inside. These blind users are then encouraged to serve as translators for the benighted art world from which they are usually excluded. For Boshoff, a sighted Afrikaans artist in South Africa, this bifurcating of the audience, this enforcing of a politics of the partial view, has a richly linguistic and openly political sense of meanings in that Anglophone African country. Yet, when this work was moved to the Sao Paulo Biennial, the same piece was explicitly interpreted as being colorblind, an art with anti-racist implications. So in this politics of the partial view, we have the idea of an intact meaning that can nonetheless morph and become mutable in different political contexts of reception. This returns us to the concept of the working of art. Work is, of course, a noun in any parsing of my English title, but in place of a reified thing, I want to refer to the gerundive working of art in its various distributed contexts. A contemporary artist such as Boshoff or the London-grown, Berlin-based Tino Sehgal can offer me productive agitation of this idea of art's working. So in other words, for better or worse, Sehgal's piece is still working on me. As Sehgal's key interpreter Dorothea von Hantelmann puts it, glossing J.L. Austin's speech act theory, this is how you do things with art. I analyzed Sehgal's work Kiss as it was inserted into the 2006 Berlin Biennial, where it unfolded in a mirror-studded dance hall on Auguststrasse, a constructed situation continually refreshed by a changing pair of interpreters who switch gender roles in the middle of their choreographed loops. The artist's own injunction against official photography does not prevent images like these from still circulating on Tumblr and Instagram, but it does enforce the artist's position that static imagery is not a placeholder for the working of the art. For me, experiencing KISS in the Berlin Biennial was particularly intense, an intensity that sharpened during the choreographed moment when the performers turned to look around the room and make eye contact with every person watching them. This Brechtian event added to the redolent sight to produce all kinds of reflections, and the pun is intentional, the eroticism of ballroom dancing, the role of desire in the German Republic, sex in the militarized Third Reich, all of the above in the present-day democracy struggling to remain active in Berlin today. In still later reflection, this rupture helped me understand the role of the event in contemporary biennial culture, and I turned to philosophies of the event to help me theorize that condition. And in this context, there's a late essay by my favorite philosopher, Michel Foucault. And I know from Naïm that, he wrote 13 bad essays, but I still love him. Anyway, Foucault was in this interview with Duccio Tombatore reflecting back on his own work and seeing experience as that which could cut into the fabric of ignorance and force him to think the unthought. Foucault charged experience with a certain task of tearing the subject from itself in such a way that it is no longer the subject as such, or that it is completely other than itself. It is this desubjectifying undertaking, the idea of a limit experience that tears the subject from itself, which is the fundamental lesson. That lesson fails to teach, and knowledge is forgotten unless those ruptures, of course, can be sutured into continuity and community, whether by a single self or some kind of solidarity. This is how I want the global to function for us, as an ever-shifting platform for debates about situated experiences, shared in a polyvocal project of knowledge production through the representational domain of art. That this kind of experience is potentially disruptive, disorienting, and so forth, contributes to the kind of politics I intend by focusing on desires for multiplied world pictures and a global working of art. Thank you.